The Great Gatsby is a 1925 novel by an American writer F. Scott Fitzgerald. The book is set in the Jazz Age on Long Island near New York City. The novel depicts first-person narrative Nick Carraway's interaction with a mysterious millionaire, Jay Gatsby, and Gatsby's obsession to reunite his former lover, Daisy. This time frame around 1920s was a really important part of our history, beginning with fashion.
With the rise in the stock market and credit, it became more available to make and sell more highly priced and extravagant clothing. The Jazz Age had a tremendous impact on fashion of this time, says the simplicity driving the trend of fashion in the 1920s, with the development of convenient and modern styles that rejected formality and multiple layers in favor of comfort for a more natural effect. While men enjoyed casual suits and pants like the Oxford bags, the women of this time wore a lot of evening and house dresses, which were loose pullovers and colorful gingham plaid vertical stripes or solid colors. Flappers were another dress and lifestyle highly adopted by the women of this time. The dress being a low-down, neat-cut dress that defied the social norms of this time, and if you adapted the lifestyle, took part in activities and unladylike behaviors. By this time, it was also more normal for women to cut their hair short, the most popular being the bob and a very popular in the flapper style, and developed an easy-to-maintain change and changed the lives of women forever. This era also gave birth to the trends of shorter hemmings, making moving around and driving way easier, as well as new tailoring techniques, which led women to drop the traditional corsets. Instead, go for a more comfy, dropped waistline from below the chest to create a long frame and slim figure. The most the 1920s did for fashion is allowing women to come into and make their own terms of fashion and brand. Just as women's fashion flourished in the 1920s, so did menswear. The men of this time threw away their traditional scratched collars and three-piece suits and instead adopted more soft, comfy collars on their suits and one or two button suit jackets regularly worn without a waistcoat. A trend worn and developed during this time was the plus fours, which were soft-legged trousers that gather around the knee, and the more comfortable Oxford bags were a more baggier version of the plus fours, as the name suggests. Often worn with sweaters, plus fours were a popular golfing attire, but like how tennis wear crept into casual women's wear, this style was also popular day wear for men. The Roaring Twenties had a big impact on the fashion industry and to the people of this time, and it changed the way we dressed and saw fashion forever.
Not only was the fashion important in our history, but so was the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a culture movement among African Americans roughly around the end of World War I and the beginning of the Great Depression. The Great Migration is one of the first movements of what would later be called the Harlem Renaissance. From 1910 to 1920, African American populations migrated in large numbers from the south to the north, which became known as the Great Migration. By 1920, some 300,000 African Americans from the south had moved north, and the Harlem had become one of the most popular places for these families. The population shift had resulted in the Black Pride movement, with leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois working to make sure that Black Americans got the credit they deserve for the culture's areas of life. W.E.B. Du Bois co-founded the National Association for the Advance of Colored People, also known as NAACP, in 1909. The Harlem Renaissance was a golden age for African American artists, writers, and musicians. The end of the Harlem's creative boom sadly began with the stock market crash of 1929, also known as the Great Depression.
A bull market arises in the stock market when stocks are rapidly rising, making it a great time to invest. Apart from the recession in 1920 to 1921, the market continued to rise for almost the entirety of the 1920s. Due to this newfound wealth, people began to throw caution to the wind with the way they spent their money. Debt was common, and the keeping up with the Joneses mentality was strong. That is, it was so important for individuals to try and replicate their neighbors' lavish lifestyles that they were often willing to go into debt to do so. A common practice in stock trading was known as buying on the margin. This term refers to how people would only put down 10 to 30% of the total price of a stock and buy the rest with debt. This was an exceptionally risky way to make money, but it worked during the 20s due to the strong market. Buying on the margin was primarily the reason that the market was so strong in the 20s. This practice artificially increased the amount of money that was being invested in the stock market and subsequently the value of the stocks. This practice heavily contributed to both the stock market's rise throughout the 1920s and its crash in 1929. The 1920s can be defined as a time of wealth. The market was constantly rising, and it appeared as though the market was invincible, as one newspaper at the time put it.
Although the stock market is a massive importance in our history, so was the organized crimes and prohibitions.
Prohibition became a law January 17, 1920, as the United States ratified the 18th Amendment. In 1920, organized groups of bootleggers, individuals who illegally produced, distributed, or brought liquor into the country and sold it to the general public. Within the first year after the amendment was ratified, 29,000 Americans violated the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act was the National Prohibition Act. During the time of Prohibition, the government tried to prevent the manufacturing of ethyl alcohol. If it was sold, they made it poisonous by adding quinine, methyl alcohol, and other toxic chemicals. To remove the toxins and poisonous components, the bootleggers would boil grain in wood alcohol, as both would evaporate at high temperature. The bootleggers also opened what they called a speakeasy. Speakeasies were secret bars and nightclubs that sold liquor despite the ban. Some of the most prominent figures in organized crime in the 20s were Al Scarface Capone, Johnny Torrio, Charles Lucky Luciano, Arnold Rothstein, the Mayfield Road Gang, and William Bill McCoy. The Mafia also hired lawyers so that they could keep the breweries and distilleries running even through Prohibition. They would also pay cops and government officials to turn a blind eye to their acts. During the time of organized crime and Prohibition, the murder rate grew 78% between 1920 and 1930. After 13 years of frustrated efforts to enforce Prohibition, the 21st Amendment is passed by 36 states, bringing Prohibition to an end across America.
The New Women, or also known as the Flappers, were associated with the 1920s. This decade started off with the right for white women to be able to vote. The New Women movement became known during World War I, and they showed support for the war through posters they made. The posters persuaded both men and women to fight and help in the war. When World War II first began in 1914, only men could enlist, but this new movement made the government encourage women to enlist in 1917. They ended up making up about 30% of the 175,000 workers in the workforce. These were new turning points for women because not only could they now enlist, they had more freedom now than they ever had. Flapper women could be identified because of their fashion known as flapper fashion. They wore short skirts to show off their legs and also so they could dance. One of the dances that flapper women loved the most was the Charleston, because it was a challenge to dance in the commonly worn women's clothing. They were also known for the way they dressed, danced, and talked. But even though they were able to have more jobs now, they still had to be able to do the traditional chores for women. They also faced discrimination and misogyny because of their gender, and were only able to deal with women issues, and they only got women jobs. Most women, though, worked as servants, but some were lucky enough to get into politics, but unfortunately were stopped at a certain point, so they did not gain too much power. One of the most famous flappers in the 1920s was Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald, who was the wife of the famous novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald.
1920s brought the Jazz Age to the United States. This included completely new dance styles and music. Jazz music gained nationwide popularity and spread rapidly to households, largely because of the introduction of radios in the US. Jazz originated in the Black American communities of New Orleans, Louisiana, with roots in blues and ragtime. Jazz is known for its complex chords, polyrhythms, improvisation, and swing. Big band swing jazz gained much popularity with arrangers such as Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and Benny Goodman. A typical swing big band consisted of a rhythm section with piano, guitar, bass, and drums, a brass section with trumpet and trombones, and a wind section with saxophones and clarinet. Though it was a collective sound, swing also offered individual musicians a chance to solo and improvise, sometimes with complex melodies, notes, and scales. Louis Armstrong was one of the very first to solo over songs, and he changed the jazz scene in the way it was played. An oft-quoted definition of swing by Louis Armstrong is, "If you don't feel it, you'll never know it." Jazz continues to influence the US and the world, with gypsy jazz, free jazz, jazz rock fusion, Latin and Afro-Cuban jazz, and many other styles rising and gaining popularity throughout the years. Ever since its origin in the 1920s, jazz has very heavily influenced American music and culture.